Walking without skin. Managing adversity with vulnerability.
Pain is wrong, every inch of my heart like an open wound. I can't go on, I'll drown if I don't stop the bleeding soon.
This wasn't a love affair. This wasn't a man who abused his position and took advantage of a vulnerable 16-year-old girl. This is not your fault.
Where can I find some protection to prevent this ongoing infection? I'm walking without skin. Walking without skin.
You are listening to Walking Without Skin, the show where we encourage our guests to be vulnerable, to share their voices with authenticity, to tell their stories from the heart. We will talk about hope and recovery, about overcoming loss, changes, challenges, and adversities. We will walk without skin.
How will I know when it's safer? When every step feels like sandpaper. I'm walking without skin. I'm walking without skin.
And here is your host, Lois Wagner.
Hi, I am Lois, your friend for forgiveness and the creator of Walking Without Skin. I have a book with the same title, Walking Without Skin. Today I have the pleasure of talking to Sandy Kirkham. Hi, Sandy.
Hey, hello, how are you?
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here.
So Sandy resides in Cincinnati with her husband of 43 years and their 2 dogs. She is a proud mother and grandmother. Sandy serves on the board of the Council of Child Abuse. She is the interdenominational spokesperson for the Hope of Survivors Ministry, and she's a sought-after speaker and podcast guest. So Sandy, before we get into your work and your story, please can you tell me what you understand by the term walking without skin?
I think it expresses vulnerability. Our skin is our first line of defense against pain, against hurt, heat, cold. We feel everything through our skin. So when you walk without skin, you're open to pain and vulnerability. You don't have that protection.
Thank you. Sandy is a survivor of clergy abuse, which started at the age of 16. He was not only her youth pastor, but he was 30 years old and married with 2 children. And the abuse lasted for 5 years. For 27 years, she remained silent, living with guilt and shame until a trigger forced her to face her past. Phew, Sandy, what a story. What was that trigger that forced you to face your past?
Well, for 27 years, I didn't tell my husband. My close friends never knew. And pretty much I had decided that no one would ever find out about this, that I was going to go to my grave with this guilt and shame that I carried. Because in my mind, I didn't see it as abuse. I saw it as I'd had an affair with a married man who was my pastor. But one day I was driving to my daughter's golf tournament in Tennessee, which is about 5-6 hours away from my home. And I passed an exit sign on the highway, which is the church where he went after he left our church. And when I saw that name of that town, it just brought all the memories back, and it just flooded so much that I was in an anxiety attack. I had to pull to the side of the road. I got out and I just sobbed for 20 minutes. I sat and sobbed, and I didn't really know why I was feeling this way or what was happening, but there was a sense that something was wrong and that what he had done to me wasn't right. I couldn't quite see it as abuse still at that point, but I knew whatever this was, I was going to have to deal with it. And in the past, when I'd have trigger factors, I could suppress them, I could manage them, but this one I knew was not going away.
Sure, what an experience. So what did you do? How did you start this journey?
The first thing I did was I began to read everything I could on clergy abuse. And once I began that, I started to understand that this was an abusive relationship and that he had no right to do what he had done to me. I began to learn the terms of grooming, manipulation, love bombing, gaslighting, and I recognized those signs are exactly what he had done to me and how he controlled me for that entire 5 years. He was not only emotionally abusive, but he was physically abusive as well. And so the education part for me was huge because it began to let me believe and allow myself to believe that this wasn't a love affair. This wasn't a man who abused his position and took advantage of a vulnerable 16-year-old girl. That was the first thing that I think began my journey. The second thing I finally did, it probably took me 3 weeks of just constant anxiety, but eventually I told my best friend. And that was huge too, because it was the first time that I had uttered the words, I think I was sexually abused by my youth pastor. And so being able to free myself, now it didn't mean it went away right away, and it certainly took more time, but that was a huge start for me to begin to finally tell someone. And then I just began again to continue to read. I began to tell more friends. I felt more secure. And that's kind of where the journey started.
Knowledge is so important that we understand what's going on. And so well done for doing that research, because now you use that to help others.
I do. One of the things, initially I thought, okay, I'm going to deal with this. I actually confronted my abuser 27 years later. I hired a private investigator and found him ministering in a church in Alabama. And I thought, once I confront him and my friends know, my husband will finally know, this will be the end of it, and I will move on with my life. But abuse actually stays with you. I mean, it doesn't something that ever goes away. And so I had to figure out what I was going to do with this change and shift in dynamics in my life. And one of the things that kept going over and over in my mind was, how would my life have been different if I'd heard someone's story at the time my abuse was going on? First of all, I thought I was alone. I thought I got the only bad apple in the barrel. I didn't believe that any other minister would ever be doing this to anyone else. So for me, it was a light bulb to say, I need to share my story, because if someone had told me about their experience, maybe I would have had the courage to come forward. Maybe it would have given me some courage to be able to say no to him. And so that's what began my thought process and why I needed to share my story. The other thing was I began speaking at different conferences, and like you said, I volunteer for the Hope of Survivor Ministry. So through that, I began to understand, as people would say to me, your story is so powerful. You could have such an impact. You really need to write a book. You need to share your story. And that's when I realized that this wasn't just about me. It was about trying to make something horrible out of my life into something that could help others.
So you contacted him. Tell us about that.
Well, that took a lot of courage. I won't deny that it was a very difficult decision to make. But again, I listened to my gut, and my gut just kept telling me, you need to confront him, and you need to let him know you finally realizing, you finally get what he did to you. Because he pretended that it was a love relationship, that we loved each other, we were married in God's eyes, it was God's will that we were together. And I left that relationship allowing him to believe that I ended up believing all of that. And I wanted to make sure he understood, I got it now. You used your position to abuse me. So I hired this detective. I contacted him through the investigator. He initially did not want to meet with me. He made all kinds of excuses, but it was pretty clear to him that I was not going to give up on this, that he was going to meet with me. So I met with him, I met with his supervisor, and then I took my husband and 2 friends of mine with me. And I basically told him that he had no right to do what he did to me. I knew that he would probably say he was sorry and that he would be asking my forgiveness, which he did. But I made a list of about 20 things that I wanted him to read to me so that he knew exactly what he did to me. Because, anybody can say they're sorry, but if you don't know what you're really sorry for or what someone should forgive you for, I think he had no clue the damage he had done to me over the years. My spiritual life was totally contaminated by what he had done to me. Church life was no longer in existence for me. I could no longer pray. And so I made a list of things that I wanted him to read to me so that if he was going to ask for my forgiveness, he needed to know what I needed to forgive him for. He did read the list. He read it very methodically and very without much emotion. And at the end said, well, I don't remember all this and I'm not sure of all of this, but I don't doubt that you think that it's true. So he didn't really ever own up to it. But the meeting wasn't about what he would say or do in the meeting. It was about what I needed to say to him. It was what I needed him to understand from my perspective, what he had done to me. And whether he accepted that or not, it was just important that I say those things to him. Now, I have to tell you, in going into that meeting, I was so fearful that I would be that 16-year-old girl again, and I would again buy into his lies and his deception. And he walked into the room and I didn't really feel much at all. And I felt almost I had a little bit of my power back over him. I mean, I think it's important to go back to the relationship. He actually just controlled every aspect of my life. He told me how to dress. He isolated me from my friends. He became physical with me. It was a very controlling relationship and one that I didn't see a way out of. And so I feared that I would go into that meeting with him and he would use all those same tools and techniques on me to get me to feel sorry for him, which he tried. But I had at that point finally understood what it was he had done, and it was truly an abuse of his position and power.
Can you give me one or two examples of what you put on the piece of paper for him to read?
I first started out saying, I'm sorry that I, whatever. And then a friend of mine said, you need to say you were wrong when you did whatever. So one of the things I said was, you were wrong to take my virginity. You were wrong to take my spiritual life and contaminate it. You were wrong to physically abuse me. You were wrong to take away a gift that I should have been able to give to my husband, which was my virginity. You were wrong to control my life and to tell me where I was to go, who I was to see. You were wrong to take away all my friends by isolating me away from them. There were probably several more that I can't come up with the top of my head, but I made sure that he read each one. And I remember saying to my husband, well, what if he refuses to read it? And he said, well, then you're going to read it to him. But he did read it. But like I said, at the end, he didn't acknowledge that he accepted everything that I had put on the paper.
And what happened then?
Well, then I had a meeting with his supervisor, and now let me just say this. He had had many incidences of sexual misconduct through his ministry. They weren't all teenagers or young women or young girls, but they were women in his congregation. So as he got older in his 50s, he would then target 25, 30-year-olds. He had admitted there had been many incidences over the years. He had been sued by one husband who he'd had contact with his wife. So there was a large pattern of this behavior. He had been removed from my denomination, but another church denomination picked him up because, again, he was very charismatic. He was very dynamic. His sermons, he brought people in, he brought money in. So it was the church fellowship and the church congregation did not want to let this man go. He was continually rehired, even after many incidences that had occurred. So I met with his supervisor, and his supervisor basically said to me, we think he's a changed man. We don't believe your story is important because it happened 27 years ago. It doesn't have any validity to what is going on now in our church. I was also concerned that 11 elders in his current church had no idea of his past. No one in his congregation knew. His elders didn't know. And so I told his supervisor, I can't let this go like this. I'm going to write each elder and express to them my concern that this man remains in ministry with his history and that you should be at least aware of his past. Within a day after the meeting, I got a letter from the supervisor begging me not to send the letter and then telling me, if you send this letter, you will be responsible for the downfall of this church, and that would weigh heavily upon your spirit. And I don't think you want that kind of guilt. I mean, this was, again, going back to blaming the victim, that if I were going to expose this man, I would be the one responsible for what would happen to this church, not his actions, but my response to the elders. I did send the letters. I got no response back, not one. And then I went to his denominational leaders, which was in Indianapolis. I called the president of the denomination. They agreed to have a meeting with me. They were all very cordial. They were all very apologetic that this happened. And yet they continue to say, we don't have any control over our churches and who they hire and who they fire. And that we, because it was 27 years ago, we don't feel it's necessary for us to act. And so I really felt like I had done everything that I could. I then filed a civil suit against him, which at the time of the abuse, I was 16. And in Ohio, the age of consent at that time was 16. So I had no recourse except to file a civil suit because legally he hadn't done anything wrong. The civil suit went forward, which forced him to retire. But then he was rehired again and continued to do preaching and services on an interim basis. I then found out he was doing that. I contacted that church. I got a scathing letter back telling me that I was evil and that I was only out to hurt people. And it went on. And it's in my book. That letter is in the book. It's also important, I should say to you, that when his actions were discovered, he was called in by the elders. I wasn't called in. I wasn't talked to. No one told me anything. They didn't ask me any questions. Everything was coming from his perspective. The whole idea was to keep this quiet so that no one in the church would find out so they could move him to the next church, which they did. And shortly after he was moved, I was called in by the elders and I was told I was to leave the church because of my behavior. And I was devastated. I loved that church. It was such a part of my life. I'd been attending that church since I was 8 years old. And then I taught Sunday school. I sang in the choir. I mean, if the doors of that church were open, I was there. And here sat two men telling me I wasn't fit to worship there any longer. And so I left the church.
That is an horrendous story. I want to just go back to when you were 16. How did he groom you? How did he get you to consent to be with him?
Well, first of all, let's keep in mind how charismatic and high dynamic he was. Everyone in this church loved him. They looked at him like a rock star. So, he changed everything about our programs in the church. It became very vibrant. People were coming from all over from our church to attend. So there was an excitement in this church because of this man. So he tapped into me as one of the leaders to be of the youth group and be with the youth group. And he put me in charge of the songs. He put me in charge of devotions. He made sure I served on committees. I was in charge of, the mother-daughter banquet. He was also putting me on committees with adults. So he was making me feel very special. And he was always complimenting me and telling me how wonderful I was. And of course, I liked this attention and I felt I was doing God's work. But that was the start of this grooming process of kind of pulling me in under his wing, under the guise that he cared for me. The other thing was I babysat for his family. So his wife worked evenings. So when he would come home, he wouldn't take me home right away. He would want to sit and talk about the Bible, or he'd talk about what we can do to make the church better. I'm spending, 2 hours at a time with this man in his home, talking about things that I think are normal because it's my pastor. But that was part of the grooming process. He would give me books to read to say, I want to help you grow spiritually. So I really just looked up to him. I trusted him. And that took about a year. He spent a good year and he would tell me, I want you to go out with this young man because he's very nice and I think you'd get along. So he'd arrange dates for me. I mean, all of that seemed so normal and wonderful to me. But it took about a year of that. And then one night, well, the first time he kissed me, it was early on in that grooming process. It was after a youth group meeting. He waited for everyone to leave. He began to tell me how wonderful I was and how much he appreciated the work I was doing in the church. And then he bent down and he kissed me. And it was kind of like a quick, innocent kiss. And so I was confused and I thought, I think he just kissed me, but this is my pastor. He wouldn't do anything he shouldn't be doing. So I kind of just let it go. And so off and on through that year, he would hug me or he'd kiss me, but not often or not all the time. So I just accepted it as normal behavior. And that was just his way of showing his appreciation, because I thought, I can't accuse him of doing something he shouldn't be doing. He's my pastor. But that went on for a year. And then one night, just really unexpectedly, he put me on the floor in the living room, began undressing me. And took me up to the bedroom and had sex with me. And I was in a stupor. I didn't know how to respond. I can remember, and he kept saying, I love you. I love you. And I knew that he did because he had told me that all through. And he told everyone that, I love you. And he was always hugging people. So I was confused, and I'm thinking, and then he kept saying, I'll never hurt you. I would never hurt you. And I actually just froze. And I remember he was taking me up the steps, and I kept thinking, how do I stop this? What do I need to do? And then he just put me on the bed and had sex with me. And that moment on, I knew that was wrong. And then I felt guilty because I didn't say no, and I had participated. And then I thought, I'm stuck in this relationship because I've given this man my virginity. He says he loves me. Maybe I love him. I don't know. Is this what love is? And he is this wonderful person, and he's been so good to me. And of course, then he made it clear that I couldn't tell anyone, that no one was going to believe me, and that if I did tell anyone, I would be responsible for what would happen to him in the church. And at that point, I could recognize that if I were to tell anybody, this would be a bombshell in this church. And how could I destroy the dreams of these people and that the wonderful things that were going on? So I had a lot on my shoulders to have to deal with. And so I just accepted. And then he finally would convince me that this was a love relationship and this was God's will. And I just began to accept the relationship.
How did you get out of it?
Well, I attempted twice to go to him and get out of the relationship because, obviously at 16, 17 years old, this wasn't what I wanted as a teenager in my life. I didn't like the sneaking around. I didn't like the fact that I couldn't be with my friends. I wasn't going to the football games like everybody else. And so I was unhappy, and I knew it was wrong. So I went to him and I'd say, the guilt is too much. We need to stop this. And he would respond in one of two ways. One, he would begin to tell me how much he needed me, that he loved me, and that the church needed him, and that I couldn't leave him, and that God needed me in his ministry, basically guilting me. Or he would become somewhat rough and violent and push me up against the wall, tell me that no one else was going to love me, that I was no longer a virgin, and that he was the only one that would ever love me, and that I had to stop talking about this leaving because he knew and I knew that I was never going to leave. And that was early on. And then eventually I knew I had to figure out how to function in this relationship. And so I just accepted it. It went on for 5 years. And at one point I understood that the only way this was going to be over is when he said it was over. And I didn't see that happening anytime. I began to accept that I was never going to be married. I would never have children, that this was my life. But two people in the church became suspicious. And they followed him one night, and they found us in a hotel room. And he went back with the two people to the elders. I drove home alone. I was told by the elders that I shouldn't talk to anyone, that if anyone asked me any questions, I should direct them to the elders. I was told not to tell my parents. And again, this was all in an effort to keep it covered up so that they could move him and his family to the next church. But if those two people hadn't become suspicious, I don't know how long it would have gone on.
Sure. So now you've put this all in your book. Tell me about your book.
Well, the book, I never intended to write a book. I'm not a writer by trade of any sense. I've told people my English teacher is turning over in her grave at the thought that I wrote a book. But at some point, I began to realize my story had impact and my story could have meaning. And I was encouraged by people that I would talk to that kept saying to me, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. And I was standing in my kitchen, and there was an editorial in our newspaper talking about how they didn't believe women who had sexual assaults or abuse early on and didn't tell right away. That if it really did happen, they would talk about it right away. They would have told someone. And of course, I had kept the secret 27 years. So I totally understood why women wait to tell if they ever do come forward. And I said to my husband, I'm going to write an editorial back. And he looked at me and he said, you have a bigger story to tell. You should write a book. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to try. I ordered 5 books from Amazon on how to write a book. And I just started writing. I had good editors, and the book became published. And I think it's a great book. I will say that without any humbleness, because I've been told by so many people it's won an award And it's not just a story of abuse, it's a story of hope and healing and how I came through this. There's some very personal things in the book. You know, you can't just say I was sexually abused. You need to say what he actually did. And that was difficult to do. It was very difficult to go back and go into detail the things that he had done to me and how I responded and what it did to me. But I plowed through. It took me about 2 years to write the book. It's called Let Me Pray Upon You. I have a copy. Well, actually, you can see it probably in the back there, but it's Let Me Pray Upon You. It's available on Amazon and at my website. The other thing I found when I wrote the book, even though it's about clergy abuse, I've had several women say to me, this is exactly how my ex-husband treated me. Because the clergy part of it certainly affects the spiritual life of victims, but abusers use the same tools and techniques. It's all about the grooming. It's about the control and the manipulation. And so I was very heartwarmed by the fact that this was a book that helped other women as well, not just those abused by clergy.
Wow, but well done for writing it. And you must have an amazing husband who has been giving you so much support.
I have, and that's a key to my survival, my friends and my husband, and my faith. I would listen to this man preach on Sunday mornings after he'd had sex with me on Saturday night. I watched him talk about the sanctity of marriage while he was abusive to his own wife. And so my trust in the church, and then after I was told to leave the church, you know, that had more damage to my spiritual life than his actual abuse. Being told that I wasn't fit to worship and that he could be forgiven and that he wasn't to blame, but I couldn't be forgiven and I was the one to blame, just stayed with me for those 27 years. And so I would take my children to church because I wanted them to have that experience, but I couldn't engage in church. I didn't listen to the sermons. I would think of anything else when they were praying in church. It totally contaminated church for me. Once I began to understand what was done to me, I began to pray, but I still don't feel comfortable when someone else is praying. Church is still difficult. It's a trigger for me. I walk past a minister's office and I get just a sickening feeling in my gut. And it's not that particular minister. It's just that reliving of having sex in the minister's office and having to see that office door and the horrors that happened behind it in my past. So I still have difficulty with that. I didn't lose my faith entirely, but it's certainly different and it will never be the same. And I mourn that. I mourn the loss of my spiritual life the way it once was. I would love to be able to sing in the choir and teach Sunday school again, but I can't do it. I just can't do it.
That is such a shame because you've got such a story and you've got such a love. You can certainly help others by serving in the church, but you do other work. So what is it that you actually do to help others?
Well, as you mentioned, I serve on the Council on Child Abuse, and it's a wonderful organization. I am the interdenominational spokesman for the Hope of Survivors Ministry. They basically help adult women who have been abused by their pastors, because that's another segment of people that people don't want to recognize as abuse. They see it as an affair. But again, when this person is in a position of power and they're counseling a woman who's in an emotional crisis or she's going through a divorce or a death in her family, those predators take advantage of that vulnerability and they use that opportunity not to help them, but to find a way to get into them. And so that's an abuse too. So that's what the Hope of Survivors do. And I would recommend their website. It's just thehopeofsurvivors.org. They have a lot of good information on their website. I counsel some victims. I do a lot of speaking at churches to help them in preventing abuse and recognizing the signs when a clergy may be abusing. I help write church policies for some churches. I've spoken at Cincinnati Christian University, which is a seminary that trains pastors. So I've done a lot of pastor training as well. So that's kind of where this whole journey has taken me. Not what I had planned, but it's the path I'm on, and I feel like it's what I need to be doing.
Well, what advice can you give to somebody who finds himself in a similar situation?
First of all, you're not alone. Most victims will tell you, I didn't think this was happening to anyone else or that no one else would understand this. You're not alone. There are many victims out there who would understand. So the second thing, and the most important thing, is this is not your fault. You have every right to expect someone that you should be able to trust to act morally and ethically. They took advantage of you. These men, sometimes women, look for vulnerable people. They target people. You're not chosen by accident. This wasn't just I look back and I think, well, why did he choose me? Well, I could see the other girls in the youth group. There were various reasons why he didn't go after them. And so know that this is not your fault. And know that because you weren't able to say no, it's not your fault, because you only responded in the way that you could with the coping skills that you had at the time. And again, because you're in a vulnerable situation or you're in a crisis, you're not going to respond the same way you would if you had in a stronger place in your life. So it's not your fault. And the third thing, which I mentioned earlier, you need to educate yourself. Start learning those terms of grooming and manipulation and gaslighting, because once you understand those terms, you're going to be able to see how he's using those same techniques on you. And then the hardest part of all is you need to tell someone. And I'm telling victims that from a perspective of someone who kept a secret for 27 years and someone who was never going to tell. And I only was forced to tell because I had this trigger. So find someone that you can trust. It may be someone out of the church that you need to tell someone. And if you don't find the comfort and the support you need from that person, you find someone else. Maybe go to a website, the Hope of Survivors. You can go to my website. I have an email. You can reach out to people through various organizations on websites. And if you Google clergy sexual abuse, you'd be amazed at the number of things that come up. But so again, this is not your fault. You were targeted. Educate yourself. Tell someone.
More importantly, how do we stop clergy abuse?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult because we have a culture within our churches that want to protect these people, because these are men and women who have baptized their children. They've married them. They have sat at their mother's bedside while she was dying. So we have a personal relationship with them. So it's difficult for churches to police their own. But I think the other issue with churches is that they tend to fall on scripture and use it misguided scripture. In other words, they use scripture like, well, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, so we should forgive. God forgives us, we should forgive. We're not to judge. We shouldn't be judging. And they use that as an excuse, or somewhat even as this is our obligation to give this man a second chance, or to keep it quiet because he made a mistake. He didn't just make a mistake. He crossed the boundaries of his profession. And I think that's where churches fail the most. They only see this as a moral fault, and they don't see the professional side of it. He broke the vows of his ordination vows. He broke the ethics of his profession. And just like any profession, whether it's a doctor, a nurse, a counselor, a teacher, when you have agreed to a helping position, when you've agreed to a position where you're going to help someone, and you don't do that, and you do more harm than good, those people lose their licenses. A doctor who has any kind of sexual contact with his patient loses his license, because they understand that under the guise of being a patient, that patient is vulnerable to that doctor, and he has no right to take advantage of those vulnerabilities. And it should be the same for any clergy. They've broken the professional vows of their profession. But churches don't see it that way. They see it as a moral fall that we should be forgiving and giving second chances to these men. Second chances only means you're giving them a second chance to reoffend. And again, you can still forgive them, you can give them counseling, you can help them, but they've lost that privilege of ministry by their own actions. And it's not that we're judging their soul, we're judging whether they have the ability to do their job, and they've proven that they aren't.
And he broke his marriage vows.
His marriage vows, exactly. It is just, again, simply looking at this individual, whether he's capable of doing his job. And again, any profession, a stockbroker, if he's found with inside trading, he loses his license and he never practices again. That's not saying we think he's a horrible person, or that he can't be forgiven, or that we can't find another job for him, but he's lost his license. And clergy should be held not just to that kind of standard, but to a higher standard. James 3:1 talks about a stricter judgment for those in teaching positions. It's very clear that because we have given them a certain amount of power, we've given them a certain amount of authority, we look to them to guide us, that when we've given them that power and they've abused that power, we take that power away from them.
But I wish we could do more of that, because it's a pandemic.
It is. And it happens in every faith and denomination. It's not just a Catholic issue. It happens in every synagogue, every church. It happens everywhere. Anywhere there are vulnerable people and people who are drawn to power will seek these positions out and take advantage of those that are under their care. We see it in the gymnastics world. We've seen it with Boy Scouts. Anywhere there are vulnerable people, and not just children, but people, we're going to have issues with abuse. And we need to start recognizing that it is abuse. It's not just a one-time mistake.
Well, thank goodness there's people like you who are doing whatever you can to, bring the awareness to the general public.
And more victims are. I mean, the days of victims remaining silent is slowly eroding. And it's very difficult for victims to come forward. But churches can no longer count on victims to be silent.
Good.
And they will continue to ask the victims to remain silent, because they will play again on their guilt. Well, if you talk about this, it's going to hurt the church's reputation. And he said he was sorry, and we should forgive. And if you continue with this, it's only going to hurt you more. You need to move on. That's what churches are telling victims. And I find it interesting that victims are told that if we talk, we're going to hurt the reputation of the church. No, it's what he did that's going to hurt the reputation of the church and the cover-ups.
Did you forgive the pastor?
I did, but it took a long time. And finally, what I came to understand was forgiveness was about me letting go of the pain. And forgiveness does not mean I remain silent. It doesn't mean there aren't consequences for his behavior. This man should not be in ministry. It doesn't mean that I just say, oh, I'm okay now, things are great, I've forgiven him. It's unburdening myself of the abuse. That's how I see forgiveness. Churches look at it as, well, you're going to forgive him, you're not going to talk about this, you're going to some even talk about reconciling with their abuser and have these services where you get together with your abuser. No, that's not what forgiveness is. And I will also say, there are victims who cannot forgive, and that's their right. No one should be forced to forgive another person. And that needs to come with each individual. And again, churches, my church and people that I talk to, well, you need to forgive him for your own sake. No, I do not need to forgive him. That is a decision that I come to on my own as a victim. And I did come to that decision, but it was, again, with the caveats that it doesn't mean I remain silent, and he doesn't get away without consequences. And so that's how I saw forgiveness. And I have been able to do that. It took about 2.5 years. Wasn't easy. I still have moments when I'm kind of mad and angry. Not many. When I do have moments, it's mostly sadness that someone that should have cared about me was so willing to damage me and hurt me the way he did. And that's sad to me that someone would do that to another individual.
Extremely sad. And yes, I agree with you about forgiveness. And also, you can't forgive when you're still in the victim phase, when you're still full of anger or hate or guilt or blame or whatever it is.
Right.
There's no way you can forgive them. It's only when you've reached a phase of beyond surviving and you're actually thriving, it is at
Correct.
that point that you can consider forgiving. And as you say, it's for you and not for the other person.
Right.
If you could have a billboard on the side of the street, what would you have on your billboard?
Well, that's an interesting question. There's hope and healing. That's what I would say. There is hope and there is healing. And when victims are being abused, that isn't even in their radar at all. And after they come forward with their abuse, they become re-victimized by the church, by those around them. The court system re-victimizes them in many ways. And even after they've come forward, the hope and healing seems almost impossible. And the healing part is takes years sometimes. And the abuse is always going to be a part of our lives, but it doesn't have to define our lives. And that's what I had to understand, that, it would be ridiculous for someone to say to me, you need to move on and forget this. I'm not going to forget this. I'm never going to be able to forget it, but I'm not going to let it control my life. For 27 years, I allowed that secret to control my life because in the effort to keep it a secret, I was always being reminded of the abuse. It was once I was able to let go of the secret that I would be able to free myself somewhat of the abuse. So yes, it's always a part of our lives, but it can be a part of our lives in a way that we can function without it affecting our lives every day of our lives.
Fantastic. I've got a program called Be Brave with the objective of eradicating bullying, harassment, sexual abuse. What does the term brave mean to you?
I think it means forging ahead in spite of the doubts and the fears based on the fact that it's the right thing to do. It takes bravery to confront something that you're afraid of. People are afraid of confronting their past. They're afraid of their abusers. At age 49, when I finally came forward, I can remember when I thought about telling someone, even in the back of my mind, I could hear his voice saying to me, "You'll get in trouble if you tell anyone," or "You're going to be responsible," or "No one's going to believe you." I couldn't even at age 49 let go of that repetitive echoing in the back of my mind of his voice telling me those things. And so to me, bravery meant I knew that wasn't true, but I couldn't embrace it enough to believe it, but I was going to go ahead and tell someone anyway. So it's doing the right thing in spite of the fears.
How can people reach you?
I have a website, which is just my name. It's Sandy Phillips Kirkham, which is Sandy Phillips, PHILLIPS KIRKHAM.com. That's my website. My email is on there, my Facebook page, a lot of other things you can find, other podcasts and things are there. So it's got a lot of good information about gaslighting, grooming. It's a place that I think is helpful to victims, but it's also helpful to the clergy or to anyone else who would want to understand this issue. So that's probably the best place to get in touch with me. And then again, my book is available on Amazon.
Can you put your hands on a copy of your book right now? I'd like to know you're looking at it visually to see your clever cover.
Plugs back in here so I can hear you.
Because it's a very clever cover. I like it.
Yeah, it's "Let Me Pray Upon You" with PRA, marked out with you. And I love the wolf and the sheep because that's what these men are. They are wolves in sheep's clothing, and they prey upon these sweet little lambs, God's children. And it's something that everyone should be outraged over, and sadly they're not. So that's my book. But thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, everyone, do reach out to Sandy. I'm sure and look for that book. I think the book is essential reading for everybody, even if you've not been in an abusive relationship.
It would help people to understand victims, which is one of the reasons I wrote it, because people will say, "Well, why didn't you say no? And why didn't you tell someone? And why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that?" And my book is a story. I mean, I've had people say it reads like a novel because I wrote it from an aspect of this is my story and how it happened, so that I don't have to just say this was grooming, this was manipulation. I think once I tell my story, you understand how he did groom and manipulate me. And so I think it's very good for people who want to understand victims.
Great. Thank you. So I invite all of you to contact me as well on my webpage, walkingwithoutskin.com, and you can book a 30-minute coaching session with me to discuss where you are on your journey of healing. So thank you very much for joining us, Sandy. It's been great talking to you, and I invite everybody out there to fly free.
Thank you for listening to Walking Without Skin. We would love your feedback, opinions, suggestions, and ratings. Please share this podcast far and wide to encourage more people to share their stories with vulnerability and authenticity.